There's a meeting chat, which you should be able to see in the toolbar. And if people have questions, we're going to have some time for discussion at the end. So please post some questions in the chat and we'll bring them up at the end. Or if I spot a pressing one as we go, I'll pick it up on the spot or at the end of the section. My name's Paul Everett. I look after innovation at TMP. That means ideas for growth for the agency and also for our clients. So how we can help clients grow with new approaches to demand gen, ABM and partner marketing. And delighted to be joined by Bob Apollo today. Bob, if you want to say a couple of words about your background.
Yeah, Paul, and thank you for the invite. So I run a UK-based sales effectiveness consultancy called Inflection Point. Our client base are largely B2B focused, technology-based businesses, very often facing a complex sales environment. And what I'd like to do during the course of our session today is to perhaps share some of the lessons learned and some of the observations that I've seen in terms of how do we maintain sales momentum in a risk-sensitive world?
Perfect, thanks, Bob. And I should say, as we've been doing some planning on this in the last week or two, certainly I find these concepts that Bob's going to share just keep inspiring different thoughts and angles that we can apply to campaigns that are live and in flight. So that's great. So hopefully teams will hold up for us. Like I said, we were originally planning a fairly small group. It's expanded somewhat, but hopefully the infrastructure will stick with us. Topics on the right, but we can dive straight in a second. Should make a point, aligned to point 4, that there's no miracle cures as part of this, I'm afraid, but we will conclude with a few examples of some nice practical things that seem to fit this topic, I think. So just as a quick intro, why do I feel that there's a lot that marketers can learn as well as sales professionals from some of the topics that Bob will talk about? Well, I think for me, one of the big things about marketing is the role is, yes, it's 50% about positioning an organization and positioning why should a customer want to receive the end benefit of that organization. But it's also, I think, the other half of the game is about selling the next step in a process or facilitating the next step for a buyer. And we're getting a sense that those early sales steps are changing, or at least the effective ones are. And I think it's good for us in marketing to be aware of what those changes are, because if we're going to facilitate that next step, we need to understand it properly. So that was why when we were having some early conversations with Bob about some of these changes and topics, we thought this could be a really useful session. So the first one that caught our eye really was this idea of the minimum viable problem. If you want to take over control of the presentation, Bob, it'd be great to hear your experience on this.
I'd be very happy to. And I'll just make a quick reference to that Gartner diagram that you showed a moment ago. And I think the most important lesson for me, and perhaps for those of us on the call, is that the modern buying process, particularly if they're trying to buy something complex, that can't be represented in a linear form. In fact, that Gartner diagram is often called a spaghetti bowl diagram, and it suggests that the buying process at any point can move forward, move backwards, go around in circles, and so on. But there are some tactics and techniques that can help us give direction to the buying process. And the first one I want to share with you is this idea of the minimum viable problem. And it has its background in the idea that for any of the organizations that we're selling into, there is a pyramid of priority, not often formally defined that way, but that doesn't stop it being real. So at the base of that pyramid could be hundreds or thousands of frustrating problems or issues, many of which might lead to an initial investigation, but which rarely result in action. The next level up in the pyramid is the idea that there's a much smaller number of important problems, and the nature of those problems is such that they'll probably eventually result in action.
Kira is now joining.
Sometimes the customer decides they can afford to wait. And right at the top of that pyramid of priority, maybe only a handful of problems or issues at any one time, And once they're recognized, those critical problems tend to be prioritized for urgent action. So we might think, and this is probably true in normal times, that the focus of our initial marketing and our subsequent sales actions should be around either problems that are inherently critical or which are important and of sufficient impact to justify action. So let's consider that a bit more, though. And I want to introduce the concept of the minimum viable problem. And that sits at the intersection of two things. Firstly, the problem's got to be big enough, significant enough to justify taking urgent action. There'll be a bunch of problems that our potential customers are facing today that simply aren't significant enough to justify action now. But balancing against that, I want to suggest to you that there's another very important consideration, and that is that the problem needs to be small enough to allow a timely decision to be made. And so, if we just explore that a little bit more, the problem needs to be critical in its own right, or important and closely associated with a key corporate initiative or priority. But the decision group needs to be of a manageable size, and the investment required needs to be within straightforward approval limits. And certainly if, what I've seen, maybe what the audience has seen in terms of buying behaviors in the very current environment, it's that it's hard to get a positive decision to be made, and there needs to be good reasons to invest. So let me summarize. When the problem's too small, it's just not sufficient enough to justify action. It'll probably drive some investigation, but not a decision to act. And very often, even if we manage to persuade a customer champion that what we do is important and worthy of investment, those champions may struggle to justify things internally. When the project's too large, we've got an exponential number sometimes of stakeholders and vested interest. The latest work by the Challenger Group, a spin out of Gartner, suggests that in complex B2B buying decisions, there's 10 to 11 stakeholders on average with an active participation in the buying decision. Just imagine that. That was really what that spaghetti diagram was partly driven by. They've got vested interests, they've got their own priorities. It means that the decision-making process is often lengthy and bloated, and just getting approval for a substantial investment is often a challenge. So this leads us to what I'd characterize as the Goldilocks effect, where the opportunity is just right. It's significant enough to justify action. The decision process is comparatively straightforward, and there's a significantly higher probability of approval. And this is what I, describe as a land and expand approach, the Goldilocks approach, an actionable problem, a manageable project. So that's the first of the three ideas we wanted to introduce to you this afternoon.
And I had a question on this one, Bob, which I think came up when we were running through it end of last week. When you're looking at something, making it onto that priority list at the top, are there things that are changing about what gets up there? So I remember soon after the financial crash, we did a session with a guy who ran IT procurement for a major telco, and he said, okay, so the list of requests for budget I've got kind of stacks up really high. The amount of budget we've got is nowhere near that. And he was saying at that point, the things that were getting approval were not the things that had the biggest potential returns or the biggest business case. It was things that had a business case that was going to be able to be measured over 3, 6, 12 months to show a very clear return against a clear timeline, as opposed to massive potential returns in the future. So that was an example back then of things shifting in terms of what got prioritized. You seeing similar similar things?
Yeah, very much so. So I think the things that are moving now are tactical, quick to implement, confident in return initiatives that support a strategic priority or perspective. I think the other point that I'd make is, salespeople have been told year upon year to do a good job of coming up with a return on investment projection. And you can typically only do that in collaboration with your client who understands the investment drivers. I'd suggest to you that in today's climate, it isn't just the return on investment. It is the cost of inaction, the cost of inaction. What will happen if we don't do something about this? So I think all of these things are in play. But certainly your observation, I think, is very accurate. Okay?
Yeah.
So let's look at our second concept. And this is the idea that it's, I think, the right time, maybe long overdue, from salespeople to think not about, and marketeers, by the way, to think about not just selling solutions, but achieving outcomes. And I'll make the observation that I think there's a certain unfortunate laziness, which we'll explore in a moment, of labeling pretty much everything a solution, even though it seems to bear no explicit connection to a customer problem or opportunity. And, I don't understand how you can call anything a solution if it isn't connected to a problem that needs resolution. So we'll perhaps go into that a little bit more.
And please don't pull your punches, Bob, about your thoughts on the solution sections of most IT websites.
I think they would be well advised to relabel them and start again. Anyway, I promise not to pull any other punches. Steve, I've noted your question about disqualifying opportunities. I will make sure that we come on to that. I'll make the general observation. This point Steve asked, what tactics can be employed to effectively disqualify opportunities when problems are small? We really need to understand what the business drivers are, not the functional needs, but the business drivers and the relative priority. It's a topic we can maybe return to later. So here's the question. And it depends a lot on whether we're selling and actually whether our customer is buying change or continuity, because the dynamics of that decision are very different. When we're selling continuity and when the customer thinks they're buying continuity, I don't know, replenishing raw materials, a purchase they have made for years where they just need to restock. It's very often an existing customer, not always. But when we're selling change and when the customer's buying change, very often it's a new customer to us. If it's continuity, it's very often a required purchase. If we're selling change, that's very often, but not always, a discretionary purchase. The customer could choose to defer. Their buying journey is often familiar when they're buying continuity, but their buying journey might be largely unfamiliar. They might be moving into new territory if the journey is unfamiliar. They're probably looking for the same or a similar specification versus looking for new capabilities. They're probably concerned about preserving the status quo. On the other hand, they may recognize they either need to disrupt the status quo or the status quo's already been disrupted. They need to do something about it. Very often, continuity carries with it low perceived risk. Change carries high perceived risk. And finally, in a continuity environment, very often our strongest competitor might be a similar vendor or supplier. Whereas when we're selling change, the measurements, the outcomes prove this, that our strongest competitor is very often do nothing. This is really where I think there's a very distinctive, different and important difference in approach between selling solutions and achieving outcomes. So when we're selling solutions, back to the observation about, sometimes careless usage, a solution can only exist from my perspective, in the context of solving a specific customer problem or opportunity. And actually, I think it's a much more useful metaphor and mindset to use to say, we are in both marketing and sales in the business of achieving outcomes, helping our customer to fix, achieve, or avoid something, very often as a result of implementing, solving a problem, or taking advantage of an opportunity. So, how can we put that story together? Well, I'm going to share with you, I'm going to walk through a structure that I found very useful, and it's, I call it a value-centric, outcome-centric value story framework. And that tries to address three key questions, without which it's hard to make the case for change. And the first obvious one is, why change? The second is, why you? And the third one, particularly important in today's times, why now, and why the potential customer should trust us. So first point is comparing their desired situation, their current situation, with their desired outcomes. And it should be fairly obvious that if there's only a narrow gap between where they are today and where they aspire to be in the future, they're unlikely to see a priority for change. But the larger the perceived gap between the current situation and this desired outcome, the stronger the case for change. Next, please. And then we need to think about obstacles, because the gap isn't enough. The more significant the obstacles that they're facing, the more likely they're to accept the need for urgent change. And then the final component of why change is the impact. If there isn't a strong impact of failure, threat of failure, they're unlikely to agree for the need for urgent change. So those are the four components of the why change element of the story. Next up, we've got why you, and that really tries to address three questions. Firstly, what are the other credible options that the customer's got for identifying the issue? And they'll probably include not just vendors, other vendors like us, but they'll probably include in-house solutions and so on. Next. The next question I think we need to address is, so what sets us apart? This is critically important, and it isn't just we've got a better or longer feature list. The most important way of differentiation in this sort of environment is to come up with an approach that the customer sees as being different and which leads to provably better outcomes. So the third component then, Paul, is the unique benefits that approach generates for the customer. So why now? Two components to that. Firstly, what is their business case? It really needs to be couched in their terms and not in our terms. The costs and consequences of inaction and the realistic return on investment, and why action is urgent rather than it can be deferred. So that's the business case / urgency. And Paul, the last of these is evidence and decision confidence. This is something, if any of you have been reading Gartner's analysis of why technology companies struggle to get deals over the line, why customers defer decisions, the most common reason is a lack of decision confidence. They're simply not persuaded either of why we should change or where the evidence for that is and why our approach is the right one. So those are the critical component parts of the value story. And I suggest to you that they are what a optimum executive summary in any proposal needs to look like. If your executive summary and the proposals that you're making today really focuses primarily on why they should buy you and doesn't address that all-important why change, I think you're creating problems for yourself in terms of persuading the customer to go ahead with the project. So that's the second of the three concepts we wanted to share. Paul, perhaps we could advance the slide, and any comments or observations on that.
I'd just say one thing, Bob. Well, two things. One, apologies for the technology issues. We'll make sure, as per the comments, that we share the slides afterwards so some people can take the templates away. But one question, Bob. You seem to be, I think, putting a lot of emphasis on highlighting to people the risk of inaction. So I think stepping back from your comment about the number one competitor being inaction, and creating, is it almost a question of the fear of something going wrong in the change program needs to be less than the fear of what would go wrong if they don't change, or is that too?
Well,
is that
yeah, and I think there's abundant research that backs that up, as well as I suspect people's experience. I think it was Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow. One of the concepts he introduced was risk aversion, and he concluded that
is now exiting,
and that both individuals and organizations were 2 to 3 times more likely to make a positive decision to avoid a risk or to avoid a pain than they were in the hope of a future gain. I think it's always been very powerful. I suspect it's even more powerful now.
is now exiting.
So yeah, I think if we had a conversation now about the first sales conversation, I think that probably fits nicely, because as you say, that makes a good summary of what you would include in a proposal, or as you go through the early stages of defining a proposal. But what about getting to that stage? Well, what's changing when it comes to the first sales conversations?
Yeah, so the first point I'd make is, and again, I think this has always been true, it's just come into even starker relief now. It's that conversation needs to be a balance of teaching and learning. It can't all be about us trying to discover and qualify the customer. So Paul, if we can just sort of go through some of the incremental elements of that. Doing our research up front, having a hypothesis. If I can make one plea to this audience, it is to ban the question, what keeps you up at night, from your salespeople's vocabulary. I know the smarter ones have either never used it or have learned not to use it now. But if instead of asking the customer what keeps them up at night, if because of our experience of similar environments, we have a hypothesis that other similar customers have come to us because they've been wrestling with 1 or 2 or 3 of these things, it makes for a much better conversation. Next point. I think, there's been a lot of recognition of the need for empathy. That doesn't mean, COVID-19 ambulance chasing and having every outreach preceded by that. But I think it certainly means, having empathy for the customer's environment. The next point then would be, let's make sure we share something unfamiliar and insightful. I mean, I think one of the big tests of whether a sales conversation is effective is whether the customer leaves it thinking, I learned something valuable, and they are smarter as a result of the conversation than they were before. The next point, I think, then is, so part of that process, learning, teaching, is to educate them before we interrogate them. I'm not sure interrogate's even the right word. It certainly shouldn't be, but, balance insights with questions. The next is to keep that give-get balance going, which means we also need to, Paul, next point, to diagnose before we prescribe. Resist the itch to pitch that afflicts so many salespeople. The moment a customer acknowledges a need, they can't wait to tell the customer how they can address it for them. Hold back, understand more about the problem. Back to that leaving smarter. And then finally, a clear next step. Now, how do we do that? Well, we do that by having a certain amount of preparation and discipline in running an effective sales call. And I want to try and quickly run through, and again, the slide deck will be shared with you so that you can take this away and hopefully apply it, as I hope it will be, in your environment. So, Paul, the first click then is to focus on just making sure we understand the customer's situation, and we've done our preparation, including making sure that the technology works. But the logistics, if we were holding a meeting room, in the physical meeting world, have we got the flip charts sorted out? I mean, just all the basics. The next element, Paul, then, if we could turn to that, is understanding who the participants are from their side, what their role is in the process, and also, and this is something we ought to establish early on in the conversation, is what their motivations are for the meeting. What would make this meeting a success? And I think I'd add to that the idea of our own key players is if we've got multiple participants, let's make sure they understand their role, and that that we don't go off-piste because of an enthusiastic, let's say, technology expert who can't wait to share even more with the customer about what the product can do, which then means we need an agreed purpose, an agenda, and our best outcome. And any of you who are familiar with the Sandler training would say that close to the beginning of the meeting, once we've got the agenda and the objective set out, to agree with the customer, if that agenda is followed, if their objectives are met, that it would be reasonable to take a predefined next step. So we're not scrambling at the end of the meeting to work out what that next step is. The next layer in our layer cake is the holy trinity of not firstly what we want to ask them, but what we want to teach them, what insights and anecdotes might be relevant, what we want to learn from them. And then those of you who are familiar with SPIN will perhaps recognize, I think that's a very powerful construct. But I'd add a fifth question type. So for those familiar with SPIN, it basically says we need to be very aware of the relative impact of situation, problem, implication, and need payoff questions. But I'd also suggest to you that asking questions which test the customer's commitment to moving forward, not closing, but making an advance, are very important. And then finally, the concerns, because it's probably pretty common that we can anticipate frequently asked questions, and the more adept we are at dealing with them, the better. So next layer, buying enablers. That's obviously, I think, self-evidently a critical role for marketing. What can we create that will facilitate the buyer's journey, but also for any of you who have an involvement in sales enablement and so on, what are the sales tools that might be relevant to this meeting? And then finally, our analysis is around, so did we achieve the expected result? Next step. Do you need to write War and Peace around this? Most certainly not. Do you need to write it down? It can help, because as one of my mentors used to keep reminding me, writing things down shows us how muddled or incomplete our thinking is. But just if this is an important sales call, I urge you to encourage your salespeople to have the discipline to go in prepared. Okay.
How long, Bob, on average is something like that taking? I mean, obviously the thinking can be going on for a long time, but when you talk about, you prefer to write it down.
If you can't capture it in a single page, in, I don't know, 5 minutes, you're not looking for awards for good handwriting. But if you haven't got the essence of it, and you can't capture it in 5 minutes, you're probably making it overcomplicated. Yeah. Which is why I would suggest that it's actually not a very difficult ask. So part of the conclusion here is maybe we need to be supporting not just the sales process, but the entire buying decision journey. Now, I think marketers have always recognized that they have a role to play, awareness, thought leadership, and so on, education, prior to the start of a sales process. And that really might be the things that initiate the buying process. But I'd also like us to recognize that the buying journey isn't over when the order's taken. The buying journey is only complete when a solution's been implemented and the outcome that was expected has been achieved. Okay.
Well, I've scribbled down a couple of my own questions in a minute, but if others want to share any in the chat, if the chat's still working, then yeah, we can cover those off at the end.
I mean, Bryce raises a really interesting point regarding teaching and learning. How does the approach change when customers are self-learning? And I think that is happening. Well, let's make sure that we don't tell them things they already know. So this is where I think experience, not just about the sort of surface finish of the problem, but how problems are addressed in the real world, can be valuable and is a much less common component of the sort of stuff that, you know, people can download over the internet.
So yeah, I've had a bit of time to think about, you know, what is it from this that sales could be asking of marketing, or that marketing could be inspired to do, and I've just picked 5 favorites from some of my experiences. I think the first thing is around marketing's role in getting a good upfront proposition that can lead into some of those outcome-based conversations that Bob's been talking about. So classic example here is what Eloqua and Marketo and the other marketing automation vendors did sort of just before and ramped up after the financial crash. Invested a lot of budget with people like Forrester to create the almost the analyst approved business case for marketing automation, aligned it really clearly with a need to cut budgets, but also built a great story to marketers saying, look, if you want to be able to demonstrate value to your organization at a time when budgets are under threat after the financial crash, this is going to be the solution to what you're looking for. And they coupled that with, I think, a really smart investment in building up this idea of becoming a modern marketer, which certainly I was a sucker for 10 or 12 years ago, with the principle being that unless you had marketing automation, you couldn't really be in the modern marketing club. So it was kind of a perfect balance of emotional and logical positioning to create a real need at a time when, yeah, there was a big change happening in the market. So that's an old favorite, that kind of modern marketing story. I think there's something else that's coming into this around, you know, what are the factors that make for an ideal customer in this market in particular. And I think we might see a stage of going through segmentation that puts other factors as being more important than some of the traditional vertical factors. So actually, is a telco that's born in the cloud going to have more in common with a 40-year-old dinosaur in its own industry, or with a challenger bank that's been around for 5
Paul,
to 10
if I might make an observation, I think this is a critical distinction. I think the old days of segmenting by size, sector, and location are entirely inadequate now. And I think it's things like structural and behavioral attributes of companies that are much more likely to indicate whether they'll be a good customer for you. And I would suggest that we can write marketing materials that help to self-qualify people who at first glance appear to be in that sort of, you know, the demographic box. But we want to resonate and appeal to organizations who have the structural and the cultural and behavioral characteristics that we're seeking.
Yeah. No, and I think this will be a big conclusion when we come out of the current phase, I suspect. Is the thing, Bob talked a lot about the first selling, the value of a first meeting, and when we were talking before this, had a great phrase about, you know, marketing in trying to create a first meeting for sales should leave something out that sales can fill in, shouldn't try and give the customer everything they need. A couple of examples we had with one of our clients a year or so ago, it was actually an Excel template that became the #1 piece of content downloaded from their website. And I think that's a hint of things to come, where actually, as Bob said, the whole buying journey is unfamiliar to the buyers, now more so than ever, particularly if they're looking for transformation at a time when budgets are going to be under a lot of scrutiny. So actually being able to offer buyers some things like, here's how other customers of ours have built a business case, or here's the payback model that they developed, or here's how they got internal approvals and the team and the project plan that they created. I think for marketing to offer those types of insights creates a really good open door for the sales team. So yeah, it could be Excels, it could be more interesting ways of getting that kind of information across. It could be equipping sales. We did a recent session on social selling. I think we'll share a link to that after this as well. But all of these places to put that kind of information to show that we're going to help the buyers with an unfamiliar journey. Part of that unfamiliar journey is often, I used to hate the idea of health checks that were offered quite frequently after a first sales meeting. But I think we've got more advanced than that. I think there's ways of selling the value of a next step and being able to show what an output of a discovery exercise is going to look like, or show that the discovery exercise itself is going to be an interesting and enjoyable one. This is a customer experience journey mapping exercise that Oracle used to run years ago, but still really effective, I think. And then finally, a bit of a plea that we shouldn't, as marketers, see our role ending when we hand over a lead. It's more that the job's at best half done then. Like Bob said, the sales job isn't done when the contract's signed, and I don't think marketing's job is done when the lead is handed over. There's a lot that can be done right the way through supporting that process to develop the opportunity and close it, that we should be collaborating really closely on, particularly as some of the sales techniques are changing, as we've seen. I'm just interested if there's any last questions from the audience on the chat, or I did probably have a last one to you, Bob, just on that topic of the unfamiliar buying process.
Unknown participant journey is now exiting.
And I'm interested if there's anything you've seen that feels particularly effective at supporting that if a buyer is immature, as for example marketers were back in 2008 when marketing automation was being presented to us.
Actually, one of the components you've shared is, I think, a very useful way of dealing with that, and that's helping to guide the buyer through their considerations and the steps they need to go through. I mean, it needs to be done in a way that it doesn't obviously bias them towards your solution. In the old days, product marketers used to have sort of feature function comparisons, which their product would always win because they'd been very selective, right, about which characteristics. But I think if we sense that the buyer's on unfamiliar territory, then we should absolutely be sharing how other similar organizations have navigated that. We should be sharing both positive stories and, maybe alerting them to the pitfalls of what happens if they haven't got a proper and complete grip of it. So, if we see our role as educators, educating them in the process and not just pitching our product, ultimately our value is much, much higher to them, and our credibility, honestly, as well.
Final question, Bob. We had one from Steve, who's interested in who your mentor was that you referred to earlier on with a quote.
I think actually it was a guy called Alan Furness at HP a lot longer ago than I care to remember, and he probably, as I do so often, creatively stole it from someone else.
Very good, thank you. Last comment from Julia about nurturing the leads after presenting proposals and that don't close. And it's a big bugbear of mine, I think, with this thing about marketing handing a lead over. Actually, there's a massive opportunity often in leads that didn't close from 6 months, 9 months, 12 months ago that often don't get fed back into the process properly.
That's really critical. The really good organizations do a dramatically better job of it than others who think, if I haven't got the order, the thing's dead. And I think what we need to understand is whether the issue has gone away. Mm-hmm. That's key to nurturing, because it might very well be that the issue still exists. That issue may grow in significance over time. And if the reason we lost the deal wasn't because a competitor won it, but because the customer decided, not to do anything, but the issue remains, then the role of marketing and selling in keeping that issue in front of the customer, helping them see consequences of not addressing the issue that hadn't maybe previously occurred to them, just ratcheting up almost in a constructive way, ratcheting up the need to do something.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the time, Bob. And again, thanks to the audience for sticking with us through some of the glitches. I hope the screen share in the second half worked for as many people as possible, but we'll share some follow-on information and some links to some of those templates that Bob shared. Thank you.
Looks like we might need to go back in the studio.
There we are. Look forward to seeing you again soon, Bob.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks
guys.
so much, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.